Welcome back to Critical Policy Conversations. This is our 8th episode. If you don't know who I am by now, I'm your host, Eric Felix, an assistant professor at San Diego State University. Preparing for this conversation, Dr. D.L. Stewart inspired me to finally open up La Paperson's A Third University is Possible. And so our theme for today is In the Machinery, Dismantling Systems and Advancing the Public Good. D.L. Stewart is professor in the School of Education at Colorado State, Go Rammies, and studies the philosophy and history of U.S. higher education. All right, so thank you so much for joining us, Dr. D.L. Stewart. It's been a great pleasure just to prepare for this conversation and think about the type of topics we could cover. And before we formally get started, I'm just hoping to learn more about how you're doing, how you're sustaining yourself, and what you're prioritizing during the pandemic.
Oh, I'm taking it one day at a time. There are always very long to-do lists of things happening that stretch across the entire week, try to get things done. But, I'm trying to prioritize finding moments of rest, micro moments of rest, as it were, where I can just not do anything, even if that's just for 15 minutes. Like trying to get up from the computer and trying to be intentional about that. And when I can do that, that's a small win. I can celebrate is that I did not fill the 15 minutes between one meeting and the next with just sitting and doing email. So trying to be really mindful and really conscious of stopping.
There is so much going on, both in the world, but also in our minds, in our head about what we can do, what we should do, and everything in between, and just ways to rest and relax. I think about that as well. I've
Yeah.
downloaded an app for sleep meditation because if I don't do that, my mind
Mhm.
wanders for an extra 2-3 hours, and I'm even more
Yeah,
sluggish and tired. And so,
absolutely.
what are some of the origins of Dr. Stewart, in my opinion, being a scholar and activist that lives out their work? When you read a bio and it says that it's grounded in an ethic of love and towards justice, and then you see the body of work and you're like, damn, that's lived out, that's embodied. Talk to me about that journey and that trajectory to being the scholar and person you are today.
Sure. Well, before I go any further, Eric, do also have to acknowledge I'm coming to you with you from the Front Range of northern Colorado, which are the original homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations, and which were also places of hunting and living for the Kiowa, Lakota, and Comanche
Mhm.
peoples. And I think that's an important to orient myself in the place that I am, because thinking about place and space, even though I haven't done it intentionally in terms of those specific scholarly constructs in my work, but place and space have a lot to do with who I am and how I approach my work. From someone who was born and raised in New York City, and particularly specifically in Harlem, in New York, and went from that environment to predominantly white high school, independent private high school, from there into college in a predominantly white space, and then to working in a predominantly white space, right? And so I've been in predominantly white educational spaces since I started high school. But then also coming from living in a place and growing up in a place that was not at all predominantly white, right? And so straddling, in a sense, continuing to straddle those, to borrow from Du Bois, those dual consciousnesses, the consciousness of coming from a place informed by, shaped by, lived out by, and with other people, and predominantly Black people in Harlem, right, to going into educational spaces and the consciousness that those are not spaces designed for me,
Mm.
right? That didn't have me in mind, that did not expect me, right? Therefore, would not, there's no expectation for me in the space, right? And so, therefore, the space does not fit, And so, walking that dual consciousness, right, of what it takes to navigate the self and in and through and of place. And for me, like that's part of what drew me into the academy and doing the work that I've done has been about really targeting my work, my advocacy, as you were, at the academy,
Mm.
right? On behalf of myself and others who live, move, and breathe like I do, right? And not just racially, but in terms of gender and sexuality and social class as well, and disability. So that push, trying to exert force on the academy. Sarah Ahmed talks about brick walls, and the brick walls of the academy that are erected that can block work around equity and diversity. And I've read that just maybe six or so, no, 7 or so years ago, and it really made a lot of sense to me to help me understand like sort of what the action I was doing was really about trying to exert some force against that brick, and in helping me to understand why, as much as I have been in others, right, being in community with other scholars and community activists who've all been trying to push against this wall and exert force on this brick wall, why we haven't really sometimes gotten anywhere in the large macro scheme of things.
When you mentioned that brick wall and the barriers in the academy, I recently had a simple suggestion brought on by students that we discursively analyze our curriculum and content in the courses for the ways they address or don't address anti-blackness, settler colonialism, and basically all the buzzwords that were included in like the university's resolution against anti-blackness, right? And
Right.
the first suggestion was to develop a proposal to do this work. And then the second one was to attend a DEI committee so that they can vet the idea and then potentially get back to your department. And so ultimately, like 4 to 5 month process. And I go
Right.
back to my students that are advocating for this, right? Not yet demands, and primarily Black students. And I talked to them and mentioned that this bureaucracy is in place for your ideas to not necessarily take root, but to be shuffled from one organizational arrangement on campus to another. And then
Yep.
maybe you get dissuaded after waiting so many months to do this work.
Right.
And it's, I don't know, disheartening or not, but I mean, because we study these issues at other institutions, and then I'll go to a community college site, work with the presidents there, and ask
Right.
them what they want to tackle, and we'll tackle that for 8 months, and then you try to do something in your own backyard per se, and nothing,
Mhm.
um, which is not surprising, but
Right.
disheartening to say the least.
Indeed. It is. It is.
And so now I'm thinking, in your work, what are you advocating for in terms of pushing the academy in a certain direction, or what are you trying to dismantle?
So I remember I always go back to why I wanted to write and research and teach in the particular field that I had chosen, which was higher ed and student affairs. And that was because I didn't want anybody else's children to, and children of children, right, to have the kind of college experience that I and my cohort of peers did
Hmm.
in undergrad. And so the goal had been, as I started in, for a good portion of my scholarly career, has been to attempt to impact or affect how student affairs professionals did their work. So, how could I help instill a different kind of consciousness and equity, to use Estela Bensomon's work and equity mindedness, if you will, um, in emerging student affairs professionals and at the doctoral level, those who were already in mid and senior level positions to approach their work differently so that the co-curricular spaces on campus
Mm.
um, would shift, right? And particularly in residential institutions, those co-curricular spaces matter, right?
Yeah.
Because they're where students live and work outside when they leave the academic classroom. And so that was what I was trying to disrupt. Really, was the whiteness, right, of student affairs practice, the racelessness,
Mm-hmm.
right, of student affairs practice. And when I use whiteness, I'm thinking about it as myself and Z Nicolazzo wrote about it as a container, right? Within whiteness are all these other dominant norms and habits and ways of being. So that includes patriarchy and heterosexism and transphobia, right? Misogyny, all of those things are contained within whiteness, really, as expressions of white supremacy. And I wanted to disrupt that in the spaces that embodied, so that minoritized students, whether minoritized by race, gender, class, sexuality, and or disability, particularly also faith and religion, would experience that environment differently, would experience that environment as places where they could also learn, develop, and develop. I've kind of broken up with the word develop, but learn and grow, right? And come into themselves, into their own power, uninhibited,
Mm.
right? By the whiteness of the spaces they had to function within.
So that kind of brings me to our first talking point, which is reshaping higher education into a radically democratic space. And like a good professor, you had me do some reading. So this is a book that I purchased and we put it on the shelf like many of us had done. But I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on reshaping higher education to be more of a radically democratic space.
Yeah. And, all of those are words that, depending on the day you ask me, I have doubts and conflicts and all kinds of things, all kinds of feelings about. I think higher education's better days. I'm not sure that it's possible to shift the space, to transform the space to be radically democratic. On its better days, I'm not sure. On its worst days, I'm like, no, this is not possible. It's never going to happen. And that unsureness, that unsurety, comes again from those brick walls, comes from the deepening embeddedness of higher education in neoliberal and capitalist systems, which it had always been a part of from the beginning, right? And is continues to be deeply implicated in capitalist projects and neoliberal and colonial projects. And so this radical democracy, when I think about radically democratic, I'm thinking about it in the ways that Cornel West has described it in the past, where we're talking about, truly of the people and for the people and by the people, not the oligarchs, right? Not the power center, but really about the people and is it working for the people? And what we have now is not a democracy. I'm talking about societal context of the United States. We don't have a democracy. We don't. But there are always people on the ground, and this is LaPaperson's argument is that there are always people on the ground subverting the machinery. And I think LaPaperson is absolutely right about that. And I think about Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy and her discussion of fractals and small wins and what are the ways that And LaPaperson also engages this idea of what can I do where I am to transform this space?
Mhm.
Okay. I like to remind people that we often have more autonomy than we think we do to make change, right? And so you talked about, the first year faculty member in class. Well, your syllabus is your syllabus,
Yeah.
right? That space you hold in the classroom that you can co-construct with your students is your space. And there is some capacity to do things differently. And so I'm trying to sort of pull myself back from perhaps the lofty vision of my junior scholar years, right, where I wanted to change the world and impact everything at the macro level, and really think about those big systems and structures are replicated in smaller spaces. So how can I think about moving to more micro level transformation and disruption? And the more of us that perhaps are doing that, who are building up as we're tearing down, right? I think eventually we do get to the larger systems and structures.
For our second topic, it's
Okay.
about making our work matter. And by intent or survival, you've done an amazing job of weaving personal, political, professional in your scholarship. Beyond publications, your writings in public media, I can think of for months and months and months, the Inside Higher Ed piece on the language of appeasement being shared, being read and cited and even co-opted by others, right? Which is its own thing.
That's
The,
when you know you've made it, right? When people are like plagiarizing you and
and then most recently your Qualab webinar. That's not really taught, right? It's to engage and to demonstrate a level of care for community and for others. I mean, I think sometimes it's quite the opposite, being a recent graduate, that we're socialized, or there are socializing forces that seek to remove the human from the research, to stay objective and to promote publications over everything. And so talk to me about your approach, and whether, again, not to use develop because you say don't like that one, but how you've grown as a scholar to think about your work and everything you do as advocacy.
right. So I think for me that was really has been informed by looking at, the elders, my elders and my ancestors, right? Coming from folks like Ida B. Wells Barnett, who use journalism to impact public dialogue and to draw attention,
Mhm.
right, to the terrorism of lynching, right, that was happening across particularly the South, but not exclusively to the South in the early 1900s. I come from W.B. Du Bois, and Du Bois as a scholar, as a sociologist, as a historian, as right, he just did all the things, right, in terms of scholarship, but he was also on the ground and doing movement work. I think about Angela Davis, right, and looking at how she has moved in and through and across scholarly and community spaces and back again, right? Kimberly Crenshaw, I could talk about Bell Hooks, who does things, also, I talked about Cornell West earlier. So there's this whole legacy of elders and ancestors who have been a part of the academy, but never made themselves of the academy, right? So I was talking to some folks earlier at Cal State Long Beach and some of their students, and there's a difference between recognizing that an institution gives you a paycheck
Mhm.
and helps pay your bills, right? And owing allegiance to that institution. And so as I've watched these others, that I've called, and many others who I have not named, so please charge it to my head and not my heart, those that are watching and listening. I know people are saying, you didn't say, no, I didn't call everybody. Being very careful throughout my career to remind myself I don't owe my allegiance to the institution. I owe my allegiance to minoritized people within these institutions and without them that are outside of the institutions. That's where my allegiance goes.
That's a strong reminder for me and for many of us in terms of the importance of the engagement with community rather than the affiliation or even the title.
Right,
Especially the institution that, as you've mentioned, will not love you back regardless of the amount of hours, the amount of mental strain, and physical stress you put yourself through.
right. And so the work continues no matter where I am. The work stays the same.
Yeah, yeah. So as we wind down the conversation, I'm just wondering if you can share some thoughts or pearls of wisdom around pause, rest,
Mhm.
and the ways that we can recharge.
Yeah. Pearls of wisdom. I don't know that I have any, Eric, really, because I am very bad at doing this, at trying to carve the space. As much as I know it is so important. And that's why I talked earlier, at the very beginning about micro rest, micro spaces. Not all of us have the same opportunity to be able to step away,
Mhm.
right? So when you're in a leadership role like I am as a co-coordinator of a program, like there's a ton of responsibility there to other people, okay, to students, to the faculty that you're working with, to getting the bureaucracies of the institution. And when you're not in those roles, there is a lot more, can be a lot more flexibility, right? To step back and pause, you know. And yet, no matter where you sit in the institutional hierarchy, pausing and are important. And so some of that happens through committees of no,
Mm.
right? Before you take on one more thing, who are you checking in with? Do you have a crew of people to check in with? To say, I'm thinking about this. What do you think? Should I say no? And people who are willing to tell you, no, sit down. You have enough on your plate, right? And I'm fortunate to have that crew of people who do that with and for me, and for whom I do that as well.
If we are engaging in rest as something intentional and active, to also not necessarily broadcast it, but to role model it for students who don't see that, right? They just see a professor that's doing X, Y, Z and always working, and it's like, no, like I pause, I take days off. I tell students when my writing is off, I'm not going to struggle for 3 hours to get a sentence going. I'm just going to like
Right,
take a walk or do something else because I'm just not there that day. And
right.
it's important for you to recognize that things are weighing heavy over you, whether it's family, personal,
Mhm.
economics, anything, right? Turn on the news, social media, like the current period we're in right now, there is so much tension and fear and
Right,
anxiety, and it's important for me and for others to role model that rest and pause should be expected and be routine and break from the pressures of always being productive as an
exactly,
employee of an institution, of a neoliberal organization that
exactly.
expects and exacts your labor and productivity.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I
Um,
have another friend who's talked about being good sister friend who's talked about working to be worse at email.
mm,
So not having to do the really fast response, you know, all the time, that it's okay if an email doesn't get responded to for a
yeah,
day.
yeah. I don't do email on Mondays because or else it's just everything from Friday and the weekend, and,
Right.
and it's not a good way for me to start the week feeling inundated with an inbox. and having to respond. So I don't check email on Monday. I do it on Tuesday. So Monday gives me a chance to plan out the week, write a
Yeah.
little bit, and not have that sense of anxiety that there's X amount of emails waiting for you to respond.
Nice. Nice. Mhm.
And with the thought of not focusing on institutions or productivity, I know it's Friday afternoon for both of us,
Yeah.
and I just want to thank you for sharing any amount of time with me and with those that are tuning in.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me into this conversation. I really appreciated it.
As always, thank you for tuning in to our episode of Critical Policy Conversations. Big shout out to our guest today, Dr. DL Stewart, for their time, their energy, and their insight.